All right, on to the last RGW session of the day. So it looks like this one's multi-tenancy.
Yeah, that's right. So we discussed this before, probably in the previous CDS too. But and we were expecting Radosław to talk about it, but apparently he's not here. But let's go over it. So the current user scheme in the Rados gateway kind of follows the way S3 defines the users, in which you have one global user namespace, and that applies to buckets too. So if you create a bucket named foo, you are the winner because you are the only one having bucket named foo in the entire system. Whereas with Swift, it's completely different. You have an account and under or tenant, and under the tenant, if you can create a bucket foo, it only applies to that tenant. You can create a second tenant. You can have the same name for a bucket. It's obviously going to be a different bucket instance. Swift, on the other hand, can create multiple users within this tenant, but they're all going to look at the same data. So when they list all their buckets, all their containers in Swift, they're going to see the same list of containers. So in the Rados gateway, we tried to create some kind of a similar implementation with regard to the users. So we have a user account or a UID, and the user can have sub-users, and sub-users are entities that are not real entities. It's not deep real users. These are just pointers to the same user, and maybe have some kind of an operation mask that allows them or allows the administrator to configure whether the users can have read-only access or read-write access, but they all share the same data of the same user. But they are not first-class citizens of the gateway. They're basically just pointers at the user. For example, I know that users were actually using sub-users to create for working with S3, but that's kind of a abusing the system. It's not what was designed for originally. It might be working, but so that's the premise that we work on. The requirement here was for users to be able to create different tenants within the gateway. Now, what different tenant means is basically the ability to create different namespaces, and in those namespaces we can put both users, and when I'm saying users, I'm talking about the Rados gateway notion of the users, not the sub-users. So create different users and create different buckets within those namespaces. And we can create a superset of all the users and all the buckets that we have now, and we can say, okay, let's just add another layer and call it a tenant. And currently, everything that we have resides under the empty tenant, the no-named tenant. But we can create new tenants, and those new tenants will have their own users and their own buckets. And when you create a bucket under one tenant, it can have the same name as the other user, the other tenant, which is fine. But that brings up some questions for the gateway, for example, is able to look at the domain name, for example, and deduct the bucket name from the domain name. Now the question is, so how do you do it if you have different buckets on different tenants? So, well, what you can do is say, okay, you have different default tenant now. You can specify which is the default tenant for accessing a specific bucket. Or there are other questions like what to do if are you allowing users from different tenants to access the data, or when accessing data on a specific tenant, everything's going to be on the same tenant, which I think I don't see why not allowing cross-tenant operations. So, for example, if you create an object, you can specify the access for that object and say, okay, user foo from tenant bar can read that object, whether user buzz from tenant bar 2 can write into it. It can happen. Now, what we can do is make it so that for each bucket that you access, it by default that if you don't specify the tenant that you're gonna access is that specific user's tenant, that specific bucket's tenant. So if you created a tenant, created a bucket, you're putting data there and you're setting an ACL and you don't specify the tenant for that object, for that ACL, is going to be the tenant for that specific bucket. But if you do explicitly specify a tenant, then the explicitly stated tenant is the one that you explicitly stated. I think that's the premise that we're talking about. Now, what kind of information we want to have about the tenant? And I'm not sure the tenant even needs to be an explicit entity in the system. It can be an implicit artifact of the way you create buckets or you create the users, or that's one thing. But probably it is a good idea to be able to have a tenant entity. But what kind of information is it going to have? So maybe a tenant entity can hold what's the default placement target for that specific tenant, what's the quota for this specific tenant, what's the DNS name or the entry point for that specific tenant, although that's probably something that you want to configure on the region or in the zone group or in the zone itself, not on this tenant. Another thing to look at is how to gather, whether to gather statistics per tenant. Currently, there is a way for us to look at total number of total data that a user accumulates, and there's some kind of an async process that we're using, and I think it's currently I'm not sure if it only happens if we enable Coda, probably not. So you can gather statistics per user, but the question is, should we also gather statistics per tenant? Probably yes. That's some information that users would want to have. Should we apply Coda also per tenant, not just per user? Probably yes. That sounds like a more advanced feature there. More interested in the other stuff. That's about it. Now, implementation-wise, I don't see any complexities in implementing it other than having each bucket that we refer to now, instead of being a string, being a structure that holds two strings, the tenant name and the bucket name. And each user, instead of being a string, same applies to it, being two strings. Another option is to just keep the string and then parse it every time and identify what's the tenant for it, but that really doesn't make sense. So there's gonna need to be some kind of a huge process of going over all the code base and replacing everything, which is kind of a huge technical work, but not really anything that's very too complicated in terms of complex stuff that needs to be done. It needs to be propagated to both the object classes code and to the gateway code itself. All the APIs that were defined between the object classes and the gateway needs to be modified. All the data structures need to now reflect that. That's about it. There was some work that I did a couple of years ago that basically does that. At least the simpler part of the implementation. And I looked at it a few months ago, worked on it for probably a day or two, and got it to mostly compile. But I think that at this point, we should start looking at it from scratch and not trying to apply an old patch from 2 years ago. It's probably just going to add issues rather than solve us time. What's more, that the feature itself holds more than what it was 2 years ago. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I think that's about it. I don't know. Are there any questions?
You have a question on the chat.
Chat. Well, the question is, how does creating a bucket from a user or sub-user under a tenant in Swift translate to accessing the same bucket from S3 tenant? Well, here's the thing. We are kind of trying to be protocol blind here, or API blind. There's not any difference between accessing through Swift or through S3 tenant. When you access it through S3, we know what the actual tenant is. I'm not sure if that answered the question. I'm not sure I actually understood the question, though. Note that we still have the same Swift user tenant mapping. Yeah, so Abhishek says that, in example, S3 doesn't have the concept of sub-user. Well, right, S3 doesn't really have the concept of a sub-user. You can still apply the same, use the same sub-users, though. When you're using the gateway, not recommended it. Rather, when creating tenants, I'd rather see S3 taking advantage of that rather than using the sub-users. Now, there is still the notion of having multiple sub-users on a single Rails gateway user that the new tenant scheme doesn't allow you. And that's is not going to change. And I think we still need to have the same sub-users. Maybe the solution here would be to make the sub-users actually something that we make sure that works under S3, and that way we can keep the same with tenant scheme on one hand, and also add the different buckets created on different for different users.
Hi, Yehuda. This is Yuan from Intel.
Hi.
Hi, I have a question about the Keystone part. So currently, RGW actually supports Keystone as the authentication part, and as we know, Keystone already supports the tenant concept. So do you have any plans to merge with that?
Well, the tenant concept in Keystone maps directly into the gateway's user. Not so it holds the same name, but it's a different. It's all the different name, but it's the same thing, right?
Yeah. My question is the multi-tenancy feature you just described is actually applied to RGW part only, right? It's not related with Keystone part.
Well, with regard to Keystone, we already support it. If you look at it, because we already have multiple users, that's pretty much the thing. The different is what we can do, thinking about it. is, in theory, we can make it so that every user in the gateway would also be on a different tenant. We can do that, and in that way, completely map into the Keystone idea of tenant. I'm not sure it's actually a good idea, because it's going to break the way we do stuff. But in theory, that would mimic the way Swift and Keystone handle the users and the tenants. Does that make sense?
Okay, that makes sense.
And I think that's pretty much answers what Abhishek asked. If you, the problem that we have now is that we already have systems working and everything, and we mapped the old Swift account or the Swift of the Keystone tenant into the gateway user. So now, adding a tenant, we shouldn't break that. But on the other hand, if on new configurations, we're going to make it so that a Keystone tenant would map into a gateway tenant end user, then it's not going to break anything because it's new systems, new configurations, and it's still going to follow the both schemes, because now you're going to have different users on different tenants, and they're going to have their own buckets. They're going to have their own bucket namespace and everything. Right, any other questions?
Sounds like a whole lot of nothing. All right, is that one pretty much wrapped up, is it?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I guess we'll end that one here and put Josh in the hot seat a few minutes early.